Welcome to Longterm. I'm Ty King, and of course, this is the podcast where we're talking about recovery, where we're learning from people who have lived experience. We're learning from the people who are making the laws that affect the lives of the people that you love in the throes of substance abuse issues, which also comes from a lot of other things that we need to recover from. Maybe it's PTSD. Maybe it's some sort of anxiety that you grew up with your entire life, depression. I've learned over the course of this podcast that everyone has something to heal from, something to recover from. And if it's not an obvious thing, like, substance abuse issues, there's lots of underlying things that we don't like to talk about. And so we're talking about them now. We're breaking the norms and being educated in the process. And so I'm really excited today to be talking to a special guest from Jacksonville, Florida, who Nick Padlo has started the Sopros recovery there. And I'm really interested, Nick, in hearing your story and your journey. I've read a little bit the short version, your bio. And, yeah, first of all, how are you today? Yeah.
I'm doing great. Yeah,
Good,
glad to be
good.
here.
That's what matters. Because it sounds like you've had a long journey to get to being all right. When you read the first half of your bio, it's like the American dream, right? It looks great. You're like, I trust this guy with my life.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that was a large part of why I struggled so much. So many people that come into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous or come into the rooms of treatment centers, throughout the country, people that struggle with addiction, so many stories start with a really challenging childhood. And there's such a strong correlation between, adverse childhood experiences and addiction. My story wasn't that. I had all the things, not we grew up modestly, but I had all the love. I was good at stuff. I excelled in school and sports, and I went to West Point. I, went Afghanistan, Iraq. You could argue that might be correlated too, but went to business school, was running a company. Like all the things were good, kind of through age 30. Which is not always the story you hear, but I think it's important to note that, sometimes addiction catches us regardless, right? There's certain things that can make us more or less likely, more susceptible to it. But even without those, we can get stuck. And I think part of my issue was that I had this worldview built up of myself as someone who was like perfect, right? And I had to do all the things. And I had to, in rehab one time, one of my therapists said, Nick, you are not your resume. And I was like, yeah, I am. Like, what else am I,
Right.
And I think that was a big wake up call for me. But
Mm.
where I struggled was when things started to not go so well. And my worldview was that I was supposed to be this way. And all of a sudden I wasn't that way anymore. And so I didn't know how to deal with that. I didn't know how to deal with all these negative emotions. I didn't know how to deal with the fact that I wasn't perfect. I didn't know how to, which I never was. I just thought I was, right? But I started coping more and more with alcohol and drugs, and that's really what led me down that path to addiction.
Yeah. So did you always have some form of anxiety? Was it, I mean, like there was a realization where you're like, I'll never be, this perfect picture that everybody wants me to be, or that I have set, the standards for myself. But like, have you always had some of that?
Maybe some part of me kind of, there was a latent piece of it. I think it started to increase in my 30s, as you get into more and more competitive worlds and people are doing more and more things, it suddenly stops being so easy to just be the best at stuff, right? And so at some point everybody realizes they're not the best unless you're, LeBron James or whoever. At some point you're going to run into the fact that you're just another guy or a man or woman, right?
Right.
And I think it took me a little longer to get there, but I got there nonetheless. And the fall was precipitous.
So did, I guess, coming 27 months of, being in battle with Afghanistan, Iraq, I'm sure that played a role when you came back, because a lot of the veterans that I've spoken to on this podcast is learning about what is that like for them. And there's a similar process between, going back to civilian life as it is for people that are getting out of a long-term prison sentence into your reentry into the society. And so they
Yeah,
play.
that's a great analogy, actually. I remember I went to West Point for undergrad and I was reading a book one time and it was like a psychology book. It had nothing to do with West Point. It was just a textbook. And it was defining what a total institution was. And it said a total institution is one that governs every aspect of your life, including this, this, and this. Examples of total institutions are maximum security prisons. I think it said insane asylums because it was slightly outdated, and military academies like West Point. And here I am sitting at West Point reading this, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what have I done? But I think for me, when I came back from Afghanistan and Iraq, I didn't really think there was anything that affected me. I was under the pretense that I had not been affected. And I think largely because you hear about so many people that experience really significant PTSD moments. And like, who am I to complain about my time in Iraq when like, we hit IEDs, we got mortared at night and stuff like that, but I never got hit. I never lost my best friend on the battlefield. I never had to witness some of the worst parts of war. I got some pretty bad parts, but not any of the worst parts. So I'm fine, right? I'm fine. I told myself that. I thought that. And as I look back now, and I work with a lot of veterans now, and I
Good.
start to see some themes in my life and in their lives.
Hmm.
One of the themes is when you're immersed in an institution like you mentioned, like prison or like the military, you get out and you have a really hard time. I had a really hard time defining who I was in the new world. Who am I when I'm no longer in uniform and all my friends don't think and feel like I do? And, the ways of speaking are different and the functions are different. And I'm supposed to think about profit and loss and all these things that I just never thought about before. So I really had a hard time like finding my place. And I think, one of the loneliest places that we can be is when we don't have any identity. And I just really didn't. And so that was one of the things I struggled with. And another one was this mentality of tough it out, which works amazing in combat, it works amazing in basic training. It works amazing in, physical training in the military where you just tough out anything and you learn to go past your thresholds. And it's an amazing skill. Like most people don't have that. People from the military have it for sure, but most people don't have that. And again, it's a good skill. It's also a bad skill, especially when it comes to mental health and substance use, because these things are progressive and toughing it out just gives it more time to grow. And the longer you wait to ask for help, which is what you've been taught to do, the further down you are. And so it just becomes harder. And then I guess the last one is this thing called operator syndrome, where it's not PTSD, but your brain was turned up for so long, 15 straight months, the next guy around the corner might have killed you. That's not normal, right? And so your brain and your body are turned up for a really prolonged period of time and they have a hard time adjusting back. It's why you see all the veterans, they go into a Chili's or an Applebee's and they sit with their back to the wall. They know where all the exits are.
Hmm.
I mean, I've been to hundreds of restaurants after getting out of Iraq and never once
Yeah.
have I had to, fight for my life in an Applebee's. So those are kind of the things that I noticed about myself and about others that have kind of gone through the same thing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that, pushing yourself past the threshold, I think it's myself, when you're saying that, I'm listening and thinking about the situation I grew up in, which was my alcoholic father who was very abusive and that type of thing. But like, so you would push yourself and he would make us stay up all night long just so we were physically exhausted whenever we went to school and couldn't perform as well and things like that. But like, you know that you can keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, because you're in a state of survival. You know what I mean? It's either I endure this or I just, I don't know what's going to happen to me. I'm just going to fall apart and it's going to be worse for me and may not even survive. And so like you can get into a rut where you're just survive, 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 survive. But then like you're saying, when you're seeing obvious symptoms of a larger issue, especially in mental health, you tend to be like, well, that's just part of my personality. And actually, that's a strength. It's not a weakness. And so I don't need to
Correct.
go heal this. I don't need to go deal with this.
Yeah.
I don't need to go see a therapist. I don't need to go get help. And anyway, I can do this alone. I can tough it out. And for you, you became sort of self-aware that you had an issue that needed to be dealt with. And I know you went through recovery yourself. And so what was that journey like for you to go from tough it out, tough it out, tough it out to realizing, hey, I need to get help?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't realize it soon enough. That's for sure. For me, I just started spiraling downward and I was, drinking more. I started to incorporate more drugs into the mix. And so, my mental health, as it happens when we do that, we drink or use drugs to deal with mental health issues. And then the drugs or alcohol then make our mental health issues worse. And then we have to drink more, it's that spiral. And so, I got to the point where I was actually running a business out of Dallas that was highly successful. And I was in a hotel room trying to decide if it was going to be the last day of my life. And for me, for whatever reason, I made a different decision that day to go to rehab, which I had only seen on TV. You mentioned, about your podcast that, this is kind of geared toward, helping people understand potentially that might not have had lived experience. And, until I lived it, I also hadn't had lived experience. Right. And so I didn't know, I just seen it on TV. And so Googled rehab, went to one and ended up being like the start to a journey for me. It wasn't the end to the journey, unfortunately. I had relapses and I went to rehab twice. And even after that, I continued to struggle a little bit sometimes. And so for me, it was the start of that journey though. It was me knowing that help was available and I could get help and help helped me. And so I went through that process. Like I said, I had to recycle and do it again, but that started the process for me. And, so after the second time in rehab, I moved to Cambodia and I just lived at a temple there, practicing yoga and meditation full time, like 8 hours a day, which is crazy for an army guy from the South to go over and do that hippie stuff, right?
Right.
But it was exactly what I needed, and I still work with my teacher from there every week. He's like my, therapist, guru, sponsor, friend, all the things. I'm so thankful for him. But yeah, that really started the journey for me. And, thankfully my life is just completely different today.
That's incredible. Sure. Did that help you? I know like mental health, of course, yoga and stress, studies and breathing exercises and those types of things that are taught to us. Did that genuinely help you?
It did. I think the biggest thing that I learned how to do, and we talk about mindfulness. People always have this misconception of mindfulness that it means clearing your mind, and so they're like, "Oh, I struggle with ADHD. I can't clear my mind." Well, I'm the number one culprit. Not number one. I'm a big culprit. I have a very big case of ADHD, right? And so for me, what I realized that mindfulness isn't thinking about nothing. It's about focusing on one thing. So what we're doing is we're starting to train those ADHD symptoms, right? We're starting to say, okay, I'm going to learn to focus on one thing. And when I get distracted, I come back to that one thing. And so learning how to do that, and then oftentimes in meditation, the object of focus is your breath. And so you're just focused on your breath and you're kind of getting out of all the stuff that's spiraling through your mind, all those things causing anxiety, all those worries causing depression. And you're starting to focus a little more, I'm starting to think back about something I'm, feeling depressed about. Let me come back. I'm starting to feel anxious about tomorrow. Let me come back. And so that constant practice for me was like building muscles that I could later then flex when I needed to. And so it allows me, it doesn't prevent me from feeling anxiety or depression at times. What it does is it allows me to come back before I've gone too far down that, dark hole. And I just, I've never gone since getting sober the first time, I've never gone as far down that dark hole as I was that day. Now if I'm working my program and I'm doing the right things, I don't go very far down at all. I notice very quickly and I bounce back up, and then I go down and bounce back up. Doesn't mean everything's easy, but man, it's like so much easier if I can get to a 2 and then bring it back to 0, as opposed to going from 2 to 4 to 10, and then trying to fix a big problem.
Yeah, exactly. And I like the concept of this mental exercises that you're clearing your mind, but you're also filling yourself up with new things and new knowledge, and being able to calm yourself and building up those muscles. And I assume it probably builds up a sort of muscle memory, you know what I mean? To put the analogy there, where if you do feel the anxiety coming on, you're like, oh, I know what it feels like to clear myself because I've done this before, and if you're doing
exactly. Yeah. I would say we don't meditate to get better at meditating. Mm-hmm. We like meditate so that we can be better when we face situations in life.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I found, in the industry of recovery, it's the best leaders are always people who have had lived experience themselves, because they're heavily invested, like you yourself, you're still invested in your own recovery, but you've found a way out of the mess, and like all these different things you just mentioned earlier that worked for you. It seems like you're happy to teach that to other people. And that's what you were running an Inc. 1000 growth company, and then now you're running a recovery organization, which you didn't have to. But to be invested back in people who are in need, just like you were, and be like, hey, I found some solutions. And I really love some of the things that you're implementing at Sopros. When I click down the services list, there's a huge there's a huge amount of things that you guys are listing, but just a few things that you guys are offering that I thought was really pretty interesting in your intro video and your website is the meeting room, where it's low seating so that everybody feels vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so you have to sort of feel like you're emotionally opening up. I would love to hear, like, where did this come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something about the environment that we're in that can be conducive to, an experience, right? If you think about a spa, you go to the spa, there's generally dim lighting and there's little music playing in the background. What does that do? It helps you kind of get in the mood for that type of experience, right? You go to a football game, you wouldn't want that type of mood. Right. And so one of our group therapy rooms is designed just like that, where we call it the Zen room. It has a real name, but we can never change it from the Zen room. So it's a, couches, low to the ground seating. It's dark in there. There's little lights. There's kind of, it kind of has that feel almost like a spa. But the thought is like, we need to be relaxed. We need to be safe. And we need to feel like this is a place where we can really share what we're struggling with, And what's interesting is we have another group room. It's very different. It looks like a boardroom at a, Fortune 500 company, right? And the thought process there is, okay, like you need to feel like you belong. We're talking about real topics, just like you would discuss the, future of your business. What we're doing is we're here to learn and we're here to share on the intellectual side. And my thought process is, you have your heart and you have your head. We've got to fix both of those, because some of this is here and some of this is here. And so if we address one without addressing the other, we're doing ourselves a disservice. And so having those different environments to kind of cater to the different modalities that we're using within like kind of the therapeutic landscape has been really helpful.
Well, and have you seen an effect on your clients that come in, and if they're going through recovery with you, going through treatment, what has the response been for them? Because this is so different. That's why it stood out to me, because I've been through tours of several different recovery locations, and everybody sort of does things differently, but there are some like commonalities that you'll find. You know what I mean? Like the meeting room is usually exactly the same.
Yeah.
Those are usually the same. So having the low seating to make you vulnerable, but then also the boardroom to make you feel like, okay, now invested, let's plan, let's make something happen here. Have you seen a positive response from the people that go through and sit at the tables?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the cool things that I've heard are people that have been through rehab a number of times, people that have been to residential 6 or 7 times, people that have been to outpatient a number of times. They kind of have this treatment fatigue. You've heard all the things, right? The big book from Alcoholics Anonymous, you've heard it. And like, for whatever reason, you can't get it. And it's really frustrating. Like relapse, continuous recidivism, it sucks. And so one of the best things that I've heard is I've done rehab X number of times and it never worked. And now I'm here and I can feel a difference. And I don't think that difference is like the way the rooms are set up. I think that's part of the difference, but I look at it almost like spokes on a wheel, or like, legs on a table, or whatever you want to call it, where there are all these different components that come into it. And like, what are the components that when combined create a very special recipe? And so that's going to be, the therapist. It's going to be the clinical program. It's going to be the setting in which we're doing it in. It's going to be the follow-up. It's going to be how our front desk acts. I would submit that people probably get a better night's sleep at the Ritz-Carlton than they do at the Motel 8. Is it because the beds are better? Part of it. Is it because the people are nicer? Part of it. And so they take all these different pieces and they put them together and say, all right, how do we combine this to make this a great experience for this person so that they can get what, we're providing? And in our case, that's, tools and skills for recovery.
Yeah, that's a great concept. I love that. Being able to, I don't know, breaking the mold of what these rehabs are like, and recovery centers, because you've got inpatient and outpatient as well.
So we have partial hospitalization, but we don't have inpatient. So our clients are with us anywhere from 3 to 6 hours a day.
That's incredible. So what does this journey look like for them when they're going through the Sopros, like your program, from entry to whenever they're, I guess they self evaluate, or at the end, or is there
a little bit? It's your evaluation plus your primary therapist's evaluation, and it's kind of a discussion, right? Because sometimes we think we're ready, but we're not ready. Sometimes we don't think we're ready, but we are. So it's a collaborative decision. So our clients come up to us from one of two ways. One way is they come from detox or residential treatment. So they've done some inpatient. And so now they kind of just transition to us. It's kind of smooth. They already have their feet wet. They know what they're doing. Now what they're trying to do. So in rehab, you're learning, but you're in a very safe place because there's no access to drugs or alcohol, hopefully. And so you come to us and all of a sudden now I've got to leave this parking lot and I've got to pass 7 gas stations and my old dealer's house on my way to my house. And each time I've got to say no. And I can say no 29 times out of 30. And on that 30th one, I make a decision and I may never come back from that. It's wild, right? You look at baseball and you have to get it 30% right. For my addiction, for me to stay sober, I've got to get 100% right. I can make the right decision 99 times. If I make the wrong one once, I'm out. I may never come back, but I'm probably out at least for a few months. That's just me. And so it's really hard. And I think, when people get out of rehab and they think, oh, I've got it now. Yeah, you had it in rehab when you didn't have any choices. It wasn't hard to stay sober there. All you had to do was not quit. Now you have to face life. You've got to go home and get into a fight with your spouse and make a different decision. You've got to get yelled at by your boss at work. You've got to get into a car accident on the way home. You got to do all these things and make different decisions. And so the magic about this level of care is we get to have those live at bats. We get to see how we react in these situations. And then next day we're coming back here and we can process that. We can talk about what happened. Hey, I really was squirrely last night. I almost used, or I did use, right? Which sucks. We don't like relapse is terrible. At the same time, would you rather relapse and then come back into a place and be like, hey, I screwed up. We need to make some changes. How do I do it differently? And now you've relapsed for one day versus, what a lot of us do is we spiral down for a while. And, unfortunately, some of us never come back. So that's one way people come to us. And the other way is just straight to us as opposed to through detox or res. And that's an even tougher journey, but not everyone has the ability, not everyone meets criteria for care at residential, and not everyone has the ability to leave their job or family or financial freedom to go do that.
So, from West Point to being in the Army and seeing war, and then going into rehab twice for you, that's a lot of structure. And so I'm sure that are there any of those things that you've learned along the way, any of those structure points that you're carrying through, and you're like, I'm going to carry that into Sopros?
Man, I tell you what, I do really well under structure. I hate it. I hate structure. And I also thrive in structure. Sometimes people go to rehab and then they what's called AMA, they leave against medical advice. I'm like, why would you ever leave rehab? You don't have any responsibilities. But I also understand people are different. I think some things, I think there are some, and I also have some structure now. Now in my life, I meet with my sponsor twice a week. I go to 3 AA meetings a week. I go to a smart recovery once a week. I have these structured things in my life that help me. And we try to incorporate some of those into the program too, whether it's like a weekly calendar where you take it and you say, okay, what event repeats every week for me? What events? Okay, what events repeat every day for me? What do I need to maintain? Where are my problem areas? Where do I have too much of a gap? And start to look at some of those things. I think it's important. I think it's important for us to have that discipline, because when we don't, often we aren't mindful about where we are, and we aren't realizing that we're getting closer and closer to that next drink or drug.
Yeah, absolutely. What's some of the big success stories that you've seen come out of your recovery?
Man, it's crazy. It's been such a blessing. I'm trying to think of it's almost hard to think of specific ones because there's so many. We've been fortunate in that about 65% of the people that start our program finish it, and the people that finish it do great. A lot of people that if you quit, sometimes you still do great, but most of the time it's less common that you're doing great. One of our first clients, he just picked up his 3 years sober. He came to us when we first got started, military guy, and he was done. And now he moved to a new city, back with his significant other, has a job, he's mentoring other people in addiction. There's just so many of those stories, and it's just so exciting to see people start to pick up their, when they started to pick up their 1-year chips and then 2-year chips. Now we got people picking up 3-year chips. We've only been open for a few years, it's like, It's just super rewarding. People that were ready to end their lives that are now so happy.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes when these recovery centers open up, and especially in a big city, there's some pushback. Sometimes it's the villagers come with their pitchforks and torches and saying, "Hey, we don't want this here, nearby," and they try to get it shut down. Sometimes they're very, very, they embrace it. They're like, "Yes, you're welcome here, and how can we help?" What's been the response for you in Jacksonville?
I would say very welcoming. I think there's still more to go. We have not had any pushback. I think when you're first opening, people kind of want to see how you're going to run things, because our industry, unfortunately, isn't always run the best. And so sometimes people would rather go with the known that's meh versus taking a risk on someone that they don't know if you're ethical and you're doing the right things. And I totally understand that. And so over time, we've gotten more and more well received, I think, as people start to know who we are, and they're like, wow, they're doing things differently. They're doing things better. Let me go, be a part of that and support that organization. So I think over time, we've become more and more well received. I think the next step is to really, continue to get integrated in the infrastructure of the city and the key leadership, and how do we really support the solution for Northeast Florida and Tampa. We're in Tampa now as well. And we just actually started a virtual program throughout all of Florida. So anyone in Florida now we can support, but how do we start to really be part of the larger strategic solution to help people get well. That's cool.
Yeah, that's also interesting. The virtual option on there, I saw that where to keep you from having to interrupt your day. Maybe you can't, you've got a straight work schedule or family life or whatever. Like, understand, yes, you do need help, but at the same time, like you have other responsibilities that you have to take care of because people are depending on you. And so you give them an option to be able to join meetings virtually, which is something I haven't seen a lot in other recovery organizations.
Yeah, and I do so with cautious optimism when I talk to people. If you live in Jacksonville or Tampa and you could be here, I want a very good reason why you're not. Not just because you want to halfway do it, Halfway doing it recovery just ends you in an endless relapse cycle for the rest of your life. So if you want to do virtual because you want to do it halfway, I'm not interested in having you as a client. If you want to do virtual because you have real constraints that you're just not going to do treatment otherwise, then let's do it, because I'd rather you have something rather than something else. But we get a lot of people who are, you know, 45 minutes an hour from the facility, which is a lot to drive when you're doing 3 hours. So it's like goes from 3 hours to 5 hours, and now I can't work and I can't take care of my kids. Okay, I got it. And even throughout Florida, if you look at the whole state, most of the places in Florida don't have a place like us within, well, I would argue very few have a place like us, but most of them don't have a place at our level of care, within 20-minute drive, 30-minute drive. So you're just not going to be able to get treatment, and we want treatment to be accessible. So that was our main reason for launching it.
Yeah, that's really interesting and a good point. I live in Arkansas, which is, there's a lot of rural areas, and so because there's a lot of rural areas, there aren't a whole lot of treatment centers that are nearby, and if you wanted help, you would have to make a very long drive into the city and probably make yourself an inpatient, because I don't know if you could do that all the time consistently and make it work for you.
Exactly. And then you don't learn that even if you do inpatient, you still haven't learned that part that I was talking about, where how do we exist in the world, and at the same time. So it's tough, but hopefully we're part of the solution.
Absolutely. What are some of the big issues or things that you've seen in Florida specifically? Because I'm not really familiar with, that's a new recovery world. I know each state sort of does things differently, and it's made up of different organizations and different mindsets. What is something in Florida that you've seen has been an issue that could possibly be solved in recovery? Obviously, Sopros is doing something very, very different, and now you're in two cities.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that is the biggest challenge is like insurance landscape, and that's not just limited to Florida, but that's really for everyone. Like, how do we start to make this not a two-tiered system? If you have private insurance, you have access to one level. If you have Medicaid, Medicare, you have access to another level. And like, I would love to be able to Medicaid, Medicare. We can't do what we do with that. It's not possible, financially, that we wouldn't be able to do it. So like, how do we start to make treatment a little more accessible? What are some private partnerships that we can do? How do we start to improve the VA system so that they can use community care? So those are like accessibility to treatment and affordability are a big one. Another one that we see, and this is, I don't know if there's anything we can do about this, but, you continue to see corporatization of behavioral health, which is not inherently bad. I have an MBA, I've done the business thing. I can see value in resources, right? Which corporate entities have resources. And if those resources are deployed right, we can provide great levels of care. At the same time, if that's not used wisely, what we can have is prioritization of profit over patients or clients, right? Where what we're trying to do, our real objective is profit, and we do so by doing treatment. Well, our real objective is treatment. And I think my belief is that if we do that right, that will eventually result in a profitable business, which is, hopefully it does. If it doesn't, we've helped some people along the way. But I think that dynamic is always kind of in the background, especially when you have, larger corporations and private equity involved. And again, not inherently evil, but it can be used for good or bad.
Absolutely. And I mean, you were already you mentioned earlier that, maybe being more intertwined into the infrastructure of the city, nearby. Like, how can we help solve issues nearby and be more intertwined in that?
For sure. Everywhere you go, we have a opiate epidemic, but we also have this alcohol epidemic. And, when people die from fentanyl, it's a lot faster, unfortunately. But people are dying from alcohol from using for 30 years, and they die 20 years before they should have. And I know, by the way, those last 30 years haven't been pleasant either. And so, this is a real unfortunate, does a lot of damage to our society, to our families, to our companies, to Northeast Florida and Tampa. And so how do we start to really, work together to find solutions to make our communities more healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a tough one to really recover from too. I think about when you're an alcoholic, but you don't really know. A lot of people don't realize that they're an alcoholic until they've been an alcoholic for years.
Yeah.
It's so easy to go to the bar, to go to a liquor store, which are everywhere. I mean, any nice hotel you stay out, they've got a bar on the first floor. I mean, like if you've got a drinking issue, there's somewhere you can get a drink easily. If it's a harder substance, like you got to do a little bit more work. You got to know somebody, and there's street work and things that go on. But like alcohol, where it's such an accepted sort of self-medication, for adults, I mean, when you're told, we're shown through TV, movies, books, and then like it's just society where it's acceptable to be like, when you have a hard day as an adult, just have a glass of wine, have a beer,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so thankful that, I can be so public with my struggles. I know not everybody is in a position where they can. And, I've chosen a career where it's very easy for me to talk about because it's part of what we do. And I think that the benefit of that is that it is not societally acceptable for me to go to the bar and have a drink. Not that everyone knows me, but if someone did know me, they're going to immediately judge me because they're like, oh, that guy shouldn't be drinking. What is he doing in here? My family, my friends, anyone that I would socialize with knows. So there's a benefit to recovering out loud for me, is that, it puts that additional thing between me and the next drink, of this little barrier of fear. If I went to BW3 and ran into a client, my God, that'd be awful.
Right. Yeah.
So it's just another reason not to drink.
Absolutely. And I've seen some, I just recently went to a couple of different fundraisers for recovery, centers, and I was kind of surprised. Most of them are, non-alcoholic, and they'll bring in like, New Year's Eve parties for people in recovery, where there's no alcohol served and all this stuff, which those are amazing. But some fundraisers will have a mocktail bar rather than, an actual alcohol bar. But I don't know. I'm torn on the idea, because I'm like, is this like, yes, you're trying to trick yourself and your brain, you know what I mean, in a way, and being like, I'm having a drink, like I shouldn't be, but this one's non-alcoholic, but you're still serving the same glass, the same style.
I think it requires a certain level of mindfulness for you as an individual. I've personally never had an issue with drinking a mocktail. I know other people that have. There's a saying in the rooms that's like, non-alcoholic drinks are for non-alcoholics. Okay, I get that. Also, I quit drinking alcohol. I didn't have to quit drinking nice tasting things.
Yeah.
Right? There's no prohibition against soda, right? I used to mix that with stuff. So this is a non-alcoholic rum and Coke, And so if it's a little prettier, I don't think that's going to affect me. But at the same time, I think it's important to be mindful for yourself and how that might affect you, right? Because each person's recovery is a little different, and what might be a risk to me might not be a risk to you, and vice versa.
Yeah. That's incredible. But Nick, you're doing amazing work down there, and I look forward to seeing how Sopros, grows. And you're already providing so many services. Like I said, when you go down there, there's men, women, there's virtual, there's in person, you've got so many different things going. I don't know how you keep it straight, but I commend you on that. You must have a really phenomenal staff to be able to keep up with it.
I have an amazing staff, and it's a lot easier to keep straight sober.
Absolutely. So something, I know you're already doing part of this, but something I always like to ask guests at the end is, with all of your experience, of course, you went to West Point, you were in the Army, you earned medals of honor, you started an Inc. 1000 growth company, and then you have so much experience in recovery as well for yourself and helping others. What is a long-term solution, do you think, for people who find themselves in that same position that you did when they were starting to slide because of anxiety, depression, and then started to use substances? What's a long-term solution that we could put in place for them?
I think the long-term solution is taking the next right step. I don't get to a long-term solution necessarily by having a long-term plan. I get to a long-term solution by taking the next step in the right direction. And then when I get done with that step, I take the next step in the right direction. We talk about one day at a time. We talk about that for a reason. And it's like, what do I need to do? What do I need to put in place in my life today that will help me be successful tomorrow? And they always say, if you want to have a drink, you can have one tomorrow. Well, that's the catch, is that it's always tomorrow, right? But for me, At the beginning, it was really the one day at a time. I think as you start to go, as I started to go throughout my journey, I started to look at weeks. What am I going to do this week to stay healthy? And now I think I have what's the structure that I need to have in place in my life in order to stay sober in long-term recovery. And I think that for me is working with my sponsor, going to meetings, meditating, and praying. Those are my things that create a long-term solution for me at this point. If you were to tell me when I was first starting out that I would need to go to 3 or 4 meetings a week and meet with my sponsor twice a week for the rest of my life,
Yeah.
I would have absolutely said, I'm not interested in that solution. I'd rather stay where I'm at. That sounds awful. Now it's something that I fully accept. So I think that, we get the short-term answers right. We start to get some sobriety. We start to do that one day at a time thing. And at some point we start looking more long-term of like, what's the structure I can put in my life in order to be successful.
Yeah, that's a great one. Absolutely. Just keep moving forward. Recovery is something that I've, talking to people, the impression that I get, it's like this is a decision you make for yourself, yeah, but it doesn't end with that decision, right? It starts with every day that you wake up, you have to decide, I'm going to stay on this track. I'm going to move forward. I'm going to take one more step forward. I'm going to take one more step forward. Today, I'm doing that. Like kind of like what you just said, where it's like, if you need to drink, do it tomorrow.
Yeah.
But making that decision of, yes, continue yourself on to put the work in and continue on this path that you set for yourself. Because if you sit stagnant and hope that it helps or that it happens on its own, it's not going to happen, and you're going to probably recede back into something that you're used to, your creature comforts that got you in this issue in the first place. So.
Absolutely. I always say, my natural state is probably drunk and high somewhere.
Yeah.
That's my natural state. If I do nothing, that's where I go. Right. If I do stuff, I don't ever go there, So moral of the story to me is do stuff and do the right things. And then I'm happy and healthy and I don't have to worry about that.
Absolutely. Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about your story, first of all, which is really, really inspiring. And the work that you're doing is incredible and so different from anybody else I've talked to. I've talked to people in recovery across the country, but this is really interesting. I'm going to go back and think some more about some of the things that you've said here today, too. If people want to find out more about Sopros or get in contact with you, how would they do that?
They would just go online to sophrosrecovery.com. It's SOPHROS recovery.com, or they can call us at 904-440-1479, or find us on Instagram or Facebook. Find us anywhere. We'll make sure we can help however we can help, whether it's with us or somebody else.
And I know we just recently connected on LinkedIn, so I know you're on LinkedIn.
Yeah, we try to stay everywhere.
Okay. We're everywhere, all the socials. Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much again. And thank you for listening. If you're on the audio form of this podcast, if you're listening on Apple or Spotify or Amazon, you can find the video version of this podcast on YouTube and vice versa. If you're watching this as a video, you can find us on all the major platforms for podcasts. And if you heard Nick say something here, it's like, I know somebody that would absolutely benefit from the message that he just gave here. Share this episode. That's the quickest way. We love the likes and the subscribes and all that, but like the quickest way to help get the help to people that need it is to share episodes and share messages like this. And where Nick has taken the time to share his life story and the amazing work that they're doing at Sopros there in Jacksonville, Florida, share this episode. And that's the quickest way. Of course, we will always accept the subscribes and likes and comments and all that. That helps us grow the message and reach a wider audience. But the important thing is getting people the help that they need and educating the public of why we need this to be in place in the first place. So thank you, and we'll see you in the next episode.